Now, I just want to check that we have permission from our guests today to record this session.
Yes.
Yes.
Awesome. Seeing lots of thumbs up and head nods. Thank you, everybody.
Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Marilyn Loyola, and together with Dr. Orhan Erdem, we organized the Brown Bag series. Thank you for joining us today. This afternoon, we have two speakers. Our first speaker is Dr. Mary Weaks-Baxter, and our second speaker is Kiatathikom. Dr. Erdem will introduce Dr. Weaks-Baxter.
Dr. Mary Weaks-Baxter is an Andrew H. Sherratt College professor and director of Jane Addams Center for Civic Engagement. This presentation reflects current work by the Jane Addams Center on social justice issues, as well as research she completed for presentation at a conference at the Iron Bridge International Institute for Cultural Heritage at the University of Birmingham, UK in 2019.
Kiatathikom is the Campus Compact Americorps VISTA, serving in the Jane Addams Center for Civic Engagement at Rockford University. He graduated from Knox College in Galesburg, Illinois, with a BA in International Relations. He's originally from Rockford, Illinois. Please join me in welcome. Please join us in welcoming Ty and Mary.
Thanks, you guys, for being here too. We really appreciate it.
Okay, before we begin today's presentation, we recognize that the Jane Addams Center for Civic Engagement sits on the original homeland of the Kickapoo, Peoria, Sauk and Meskwaki, Potawatomi, Miami, Winnebago, and Oceti-Sakowin peoples. We recognize the history of genocide and displacement to which these peoples were subjected, as well as the continuing impact of white supremacy and settler colonialism on the lives of these peoples today. We affirm that advocacy for Native peoples is an essential civic duty for all Americans. Therefore, we call on our staff, stakeholders, and friends to fulfill that duty by making contributions of money or time to Native-led movements for social justice. Now, what we just read, for those who have not dealt with land acknowledgements before in a collegiate setting, is, well, it's a land acknowledgement. It's a statement that's made before an event, recognizing the indigenous peoples who historically lived upon the location where that event is taking place. These were first popularized in Canada and modeled after traditional practices that are done within Native communities there, following the findings of the Truth and Reconciliation Commission of Canada, which investigated the various abuses committed by the historical Canadian Indian residential school system. They began circulating in Canada circa 2015 and have slowly been spreading into the United States since then. Now, to create our land acknowledgement, we used a guide provided by the Native Governance Center, which is a Minnesota-based Native-led nonprofit. Plenty of more information about land acknowledgements to come later on in this presentation, but first we have some wonderful words from Dr. Weaks-Baxter.
Thank you, Todd. In part, what we're talking about today, too, in this presentation is in recognition that today begins Native American Heritage Month. Also, it is a way for us to talk about some of the social justice work that we're doing in the Jane Addams Center. I'd like to point out, too, with the land acknowledgements, they are posted in public spaces or read in public spaces. Not only are they read at meetings, such as this one that we're having, but they're also posted on institutional websites. And they do follow an indigenous practice that's been going on for centuries. You can find land acknowledgements on college and university websites ranging from NIU, UIC College of Medicine has one, North Central College, Loyola University, Northwestern University, Beloit College. They have similar land acknowledgements posted on their websites. And I think one thing that we want to stress here too is for us to be thinking too about a land acknowledgement for our university. Other organizations like even Tinker Swiss Cottage has a land acknowledgement, as well as 815 Outside. It's important to think about too, land acknowledgements about as something, a component that's part of a larger effort to on campuses to work for social justice. The phrase I have here, this is from a title on the Northwestern website. They offer a workshop for the people in their community entitled "The Land We Learn On," thinking about the importance of making sure we do not make invisible and erase indigenous communities that were on the lands that our institution resides on. It's important for us to recognize then the land we learn on. In the next slide, there is an image of the land we learn on. And I think it is really important for educational institutions to recognize not only the historical context for thinking about the indigenous history of this place too, but to recognize the importance too of the current day context for thinking about that attachment to land. The next slide gives you a list of what I'll be focusing on more specifically in this part of the presentation. That is looking at the presence of indigenous history in Northern Illinois. And I do shift a little bit too over into Iowa for one of these examples, but I think it is important for us to recognize too the ways that indigenous history is manifested in our region. We're going to look at examples of advertising, specifically with images connected to Blackhawk, and think too about the way that that advertising essentially is a commodification of Native Americans and Native American history. We'll look a little bit too at an example of the use of narrative, the persistence of settler mythologies in Northern Illinois, and think too about the way public art, it is oftentimes used to deal with working through trauma, but we'll look at an example, a specific example of a statue of Blackhawk in our region too, and how it translates into contemporary culture. It's important also to think about public commemorations, even signage, and the way that signage can impact the way that history is consumed by people in our region and consumed by tourists to our area too. And finally, an example too of preservation of an indigenous site over in Iowa. The next slide focuses more specifically to give you some images of Blackhawk, who probably is the Native American who is most represented in Northern Illinois, most connected to the history of this region. There is, of course, Blackhawk Bank, the Chicago Blackhawks, Blackhawk Lanes. There are plenty of other examples here. I did want to show ones too that use not only the name Blackhawk, but also use an image connected with Blackhawk as well. And please note the image at the top of the Blackhawk Lanes sign as well. I've really focused thinking about work that comes from two scholars named Brown and Knaus, who focus on images of Blackhawk specifically in northern, or actually in the tri-state area, not only in Iowa and Wisconsin, but also Illinois. And they point out though, that, as they say, far from summoning his enduring presence, the constant citation of Blackhawk underscores his absence, and by extension, the supposed pacification and removal of Native Americans. So important for us to recognize too, that although on the one hand, the argument might be made that this is a celebration of Native American history, in effect though, images like this are ones meant to sell products. ones too that underscore the absence of this individual and the absence of Native Americans in our region as well, because tribes have been pushed out of this region into other states. The next slide focuses us in on one of those narratives that I mentioned in the previous list. One of the very persistent settler mythologies is that of the story of the young Native American woman who saves a white explorer or settler. Obviously, the most well-known of these the stories is that of Pocahontas and John Smith. Our more local version is the story of Hononegah, the namesake of Hononegah High School, and Stephen Mack, her husband. Stephen Mack was the founder of Pecatonic, which was a community on the Rock River. And just to give you a little geographical context, many of the individuals who were living in that community moved close by to another area and began the town of Rockton in northern Illinois. And according to the Northern Illinois lore of Hononegah, she saved the life of Stephen Mack in the early 1820s. The image that you have here is from 1822, supposedly their wedding. This is a very contemporary image that was created. It is actually on display in the First National Bank and Trust of Rockton and was created in 1995. Stephen Mack moved into this region after growing up in New England. He was a fur trader. He moved down to Grand Detour, which is down the Rock River from where Rockton is now. And the story goes that he probably knew Hononegah. She was growing up in the same community where he was settling. And there are a couple of different versions of the story of Stephen Mack and Hononegah. One goes that there was suspicion among the men of the community, the Native men among the community, because he had not taken a bride, not taken a Native American woman as a wife. And supposedly she came to warn him at his home about the men who were going to come to kill him. He, according to legend, concealed himself in an empty barrel when his lodge was surrounded by, as the historian says, his persistent bloodthirsty foes. There's speculation by this one 19th century historian that Stephen Mack married her to save his life, not because of affection for her. Another story goes that they were already married and Hononegah intercepted him to make sure that he knew that he was in danger. What I want to point out here is that we do have this local example too of the Indian princess rescue narrative. And to emphasize the way that stories like this are passed down through white culture for reasons that are more focused on the goals of white culture. In this sort of story, this sort of rescue narrative, the young woman, the young Native American woman, typically she acts out of love for the white man she saved. She's typically distanced from her Native American community. She's an outsider, in other words. And she's generally represented as a woman who has been tamed by and who's loyal to white society. And I think with this example, it is important to recognize how the narrative has been shaped for other purposes than perhaps just what the historical, the actual factual narrative might tell us. Another example I want to point to is in the next slide, the next several slides, actually. As I mentioned earlier, Blackhawk is probably the Native American who is most connected to our region. And the map here outlines the Blackhawk Trail, which has become a sort of tourist site too, billed as a sort of tourist site. Blackhawk being a Sauk warrior and leader. He was born and raised in a community. If you look down to, Ty, can you point, do you know where the Quad Cities are? If you could point down to that region too, where the darkest line that maps the journey from like where the Quad Cities is up through what it says Stillman's Run, up through the Rockford area, and then through Wisconsin to Bad Axe. This is the route that Blackhawk and a group of about 1,500 warriors and their families, they were pushed along this pathway, which is now identified as the Blackhawk Trail, because they were pushing back against the influx of white settlers into northern Illinois. 1830s is what we're talking about here, 1832. This is during what has become called the Black Hawk War. If you trace along that dark black line too, you see along the way Stillman's Run, which is part of northern Illinois history too. The skirmish battle that took place here, there were 12 US soldiers that were killed in a confrontation with Blackhawk and his group. And Abraham Lincoln was one of the individuals who was called into service to bury the 12 US soldiers. So in other words, too, there's a connection with Lincoln here as well. Blackhawk and his people were pushed up into Wisconsin, was pushed over to Bad Axe, which is the site of the Bad Axe massacre. The group of Native Americans with Blackhawk were pretty much obliterated. Many drowned in their attempts to get across the river back into, I believe that would have been Minnesota up at that point. But I show you this route here too, as a way of thinking about the next couple of slides. One of the images that is most connected with our region is that of Blackhawk, the Blackhawk statue. This is on the Rock River, not too far from that area where we saw Stillman's Run located. And this image of Blackhawk is one that, according to the Chicago Tribune back in 2018, it helped draw 400,000 visitors a year to Northern Illinois. It is an example of public art, and I will say too, the artist Laredo Taft, who was a well-known sculptor in the late 19th century, early 20th century, who also was in charge of the sculpture exhibit at the Columbian Exposition. I believe from looking at the documentation from the commemoration that was offered at the unveiling of the statue, I do think in a large part, he really did aim for this to be a piece of public art that really attempted to honor Native American history in our region too.
Mary, may I ask where it is?
It is in Oregon, Illinois.
Okay.
If you go down the Rock River, actually right before you get to Oregon, you will see the statue across the river.
Thank you so much.
On the one hand too, I think that he meant it as a way to honor Native American heritage, but he did pick a very public space. I think he obviously wanted his art to be shown as well too. If you look at the next slide, you see the way that the image has been commodified. The way that here Blackhawk becomes an image that is used to sell our region. I think it's interesting too. Yes, and it was recently renovated. Yeah, thank you. I've been very interested too. If you go to the next slide. Yeah, the repairs are all done. It has been restored. I've been very interested in the signage at Blackhawk statue too. There were some renovations that were done to the signage as well. In the image on the left, you can see the statue in the background. The trifold, the material here that's outlined on the left panel is all about the creation of the statue. The image on the right shows one of the only historic plaque that gives any information about Blackhawk, who he was in the Blackhawk War. I think you'll see the image on the left shows signage too that has been replaced. It's new. The one on the right is the plaque that has been there for years and is fading. And on the one hand here, trying to encapsulate too, the history of what happened in this space, in a space where Native Americans would have been being pushed northward with Blackhawk in this space, trying to get this onto this placard. But also too, how little attention is being paid here to recognizing Native Americans and Native American history. So much emphasis is placed on the artist and the artist's creation. The last example I want to bring up to you is in the next slide. This is like right over, not too far from our northern Illinois region. This is Northeast Iowa Effigy Mounds National Monument. My husband and I went there about a month ago, and we had been there years ago too. And it's important to recognize too, in our region, in the upper Midwest, effigy mounds are common in our area, over Beatty Park, for example, in Rockford, Beloit College campus, Tinker Swiss Cottage too. But this national monument is one that has obviously important significance because of the number of mounds that are there. I did a little poking around too, and I point this out too, because I was very much disturbed by the lack of communication too, that even the National Park System has with Native American communities. At this National Monument site, I found out just by looking around a little bit more and trying to understand more about the site through online sources, that back in 1990, the supervisor for the National Monument had been charged with hiding the entire monument collection of ancient human remains in his garage. He hid them there for 2 decades. Another project, which you see here too, represented by the boardwalk. This boardwalk was built over a 10-year period. It's very extensive, but it was built into an area that's very fragile with remains of mounds in this area. And I point this out too, though, because even in the National Park System too, thinking about the importance of connecting with Indigenous communities, the communication was not there between the park system and the Native communities that had connections to the site. So I want to sum up here too, and thinking about the significance of looking backward too, here too. If we're talking about our land, the place we study on, the place we learn on too, thinking about the importance of the land, the landscapes of land acknowledgements, not just as stagnant ones that are just in the past, that are historical, but it's so important too to recognize the present day as well. And Ty is going to shift us into thinking more too about the present day. This quote perhaps helps us too in transitioning, thinking about that. This is from Deteriorations. That's a tongue twister. The meanings of landscape, whether historical or for the future, are never simply there, inherent and voluble. Instead, they are made to speak, invited to show themselves, and that invitation is the process of practicing landscape, which always places landscape in a present moment. This presentation is a crucial one and a political one, for it disrupts accounts of landscape which seek to ground certain claims and identities in the self-evident earth. Landscapes are always perceived in a particular way at a particular time. They are mobilized, and in that mobilization may become productive in relation to a past or to a future, but that relation is always drawn with regard to a present. So in thinking about practicing the landscape too, thinking about too our current day, and recognizing too, not only as a land acknowledgement, recognizing the history, but thinking about how we can make a difference in society too.
All right, now that Dr. Weaks-Baxter has so aptly laid out what conditions look like on the ground here in Northern Illinois and in the periphery, let's begin to expand our conversation to cover the state of affairs on the national level. We'll begin by talking about what has become probably one of the most, if not the most heavily litigated modern issue relating to Indigenous peoples, which is part and parcel of the national conversation around cultural appropriation. I'm talking, of course, about the use of Native and Native-inspired imagery by school and professional sports programs. Now, this phenomenon in sports spans all the way from our own Hananiga Indians to the more widely known examples of the Washington Redskins, Cleveland Indians, and today's World Series contenders, Atlanta Braves. An inclusive list, of course, but we wanted to point out the former two examples, the Redskins and the Indians, because the former was named after what was historically a racial slur, and the latter used for decades as its logo a caricature of a Native American man known as Chief Wahoo, which came complete with a feather in his hair, highlighter red skin, and a prominent nose. Those two teams have since changed their names, and they're now competing as the Washington football team and the Cleveland Guardians, respectively. But circumstances show us that this cultural issue is far from being resolved. What you're seeing on the left here is a statement that was released last week by the National Congress of American Indians, which is the largest and oldest Native political organization in this country, which criticized the Atlanta Braves' continued use of the Braves mascot and the tomahawk chop fan ritual, and consequently the commissioner of Major League Baseball's defense of that team. So you can see that while minor victories and some victories have been won in some parts of the country, this issue is one that is still far from being over. And now, while representation in popular culture is important and certainly formative to the self-worth of youth of color in this country, we want to make it clear that it's far from the only issue menacing Indigenous peoples today compared to how much airtime it might get in our popular media. In fact, Native peoples today face significant hardships that threaten the further mutilation of their bodies, their lands, and their sovereignty in very material ways. One example that immediately comes to mind is environmental contamination of native lands. In the past decade, then the most militant native-led protest movement in this country has been the movement against the construction of oil pipelines in tribal lands, which is spearheaded by indigenous environmentalist organizers popularly known as water protectors. Now, in itself, the most widely known example of this movement in action so far, we should say, is the No DAPL, or No Dakota Access Pipeline campaign of 2016, which built a protest camp and led sit-ins at the site of proposed pipeline construction on lands belonging to the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in North and South Dakota, historically known as the site where Sitting Bull was killed by law enforcement in 1890. Now, though the No DAPL campaign drew widespread support from across the country and in fact the world, and successfully blocked the construction of the Dakota Access Pipeline through the end of the Obama administration, construction resumed with the blessing of President Trump within his first few days in office. The Dakota Access Pipeline was completed in April of 2017 and stretches from near the Canadian border all the way down to southern Illinois, just to remind us that the world is not as small or as large as we would like sometimes. Now, native-led anti-pipeline campaigns continue to the present day, with a more recent example being the Defund Line 3 campaign to block the construction of yet another pipeline, this time in Minnesota. That campaign also unfortunately failed, as construction of that pipeline was completed late last week. The photographs on this slide and the preceding slide are all from an article in The Atlantic that covered violent clashes, which pit Native protesters and their non-Native allies against law enforcement and private security forces employed by the pipeline. These photographs drew significant attention on social media as the demonstrations were underway. They depict state security forces deploying measures such as attack dogs, water hoses, tear gas, and rubber bullets, also known as less than lethal ammunition, against protesters. This coverage contributed to the growing national conversation on the militarization of police and private security alike, as well as the prominence of police brutality against people of color. This is, of course, a conversation that continues to the present day. And just to bring this home a little bit, I remember myself being in high school at Auburn here in Rockford and watching the coverage very, very intently, because several Rockford-based activists I knew personally had gone off to join the encampment. This was back in 2016. Watching these events unfold before my eyes influenced my development as a person and left an impact on me that remains to this day. Feelings that I'm sure are shared by many other members of my generation. Another issue that Indigenous peoples face is the grossly disproportionate impact of mass incarceration on Native communities. The Native population today is markedly young, impoverished, and undereducated. These social factors, coupled with the history of racism against Native people in this country, have resulted in Native peoples becoming radically over-policed and thus overrepresented in our nation's prisons and jails. This disparity becomes especially egregious where youth incarceration is concerned, and now that dovetails well with the history of social control of Native youth, specifically as a means of displacing Native peoples and cementing government control over their futures. I'll give you each a moment to breathe and look at the statistics compiled on this page. They are from the Prison Policy Initiative and the Sentencing Project, two criminal justice reform-minded research organizations. And the graphics you see that have the yellowish background are from the Lakota People's Law Project, a Lakota organization that works on criminal justice reform issues, among other things. This is from a 2015 publication of theirs called Native Lives Matter. And now, if you see the statistics, you'll see, for example, that circa 2015, Native men were admitted to prisons and jails at 4 times the rate of white men, and Native women at a whopping 6 times the rate of white women. And again, to highlight the situation with Native youth in particular, the Sentencing Project earlier this year noted that in 7 states, tribal youth are at least 3 times more likely to be held in placement as are white youth. Minnesota, North Carolina, South Dakota, California, Washington, Montana, and Alaska. And to look at the state of affairs as a whole, the Center on Juvenile and Criminal Justice wrote that the racial group most likely to be killed by law enforcement in this country is Native Americans, followed by African Americans, Latinos, whites, and Asian Americans. That's aggregated from data that was collected from 1999 to 2011 by the CDC. Now, of course, it would be impossible for us to provide even a brief overview of every single crisis that Indigenous peoples face today. Native Americans have been subjected to social domination for so long that it has proliferated into practically every site of interaction between them and broader society. This is a wider, though still, of course, an exhaustive list that is published as part of our Land Acknowledgement Resources page, which we recently uploaded to the Jane Addams Center website, nested within the broader rockford.edu website. You are welcome to take a look at this page, to take a glance at this information. Those are all links, the purple text there, they link to the sources that we use to compile the page. And the page itself is more focused on what is a land acknowledgement, how do you mindfully write and execute a land acknowledgement, how do you go further and take action steps beyond a land acknowledgement. So the link is right there, and we would be happy to drop the link down in the chat if someone could do that right now, or if we could do it at the conclusion of today's event. Yes, please, you're more than welcome to take a look. It's guided toward the Rockford University community, but I believe that the principles and arguments enshrined there are applicable to pretty much anyone who is a member of any kind of institution, make that a university, a club, an organization, even a sports team, you know. Now we have a quote here from Sullivan and Clark. Mary, I believe you're muted.
Yes, thank you. We wanted to use this as perhaps a way too of summing up to the importance of not just educating yourself too, but taking action, and not seeing a land acknowledgement too as something that just can't assuage guilt. As the quote here says, land acknowledgement statements are based on the protocols used by Indigenous communities, as we mentioned earlier, and yet in the contemporary context, many of the statements used by non-Indigenous institutions are speech acts that fail. If the goal is reconciliation, then the context of these statements must change in order for these statements to function successfully. Decolonial allies should be aware of these worries and ensure that this practice is not merely appropriated in order to alleviate settler colonial guilt.
Thank you. Now, in the spirit of making this conversation not too dire, and in the spirit of building hope for change, we'd like to end today's presentation with a success story. This is returning for a little bit to the topic of appropriation of Native imagery by educational institutions and sports teams, and how to address the harm that that phenomenon historically has caused. We believe here at the center that Florida State University has been a trailblazer in this regard, as it has formed a working relationship with the Seminole Tribe of Florida, who are the namesake of their athletics program. These are all excerpts from an article from the University Communications Department that speak a little bit to the decades-long cooperation between the Seminole Tribe of Florida and Florida State. Just to point out a few things I'd like to highlight. Florida State is very careful with their language. They say they do not have a mascot. They say they have a symbol. They have the honor of calling themselves Seminoles in admiration of the only Native American tribe never conquered by the US government. That's of course in reference to the Seminole Wars. And now when we talk about appropriation of Native clothing, we see how FSU has approached this problem as well. The clothing that is worn by the person who represents Osceola, who is a real historical figure, not just a character created to serve as a university mascot. He was a historical Seminole warrior, riding the historically accurate horse that the figure rode in real life. This FSU student who is chosen via a robust selection process, wears clothing that is sewn by the women of the Seminole tribe. Now, finally, we talk about putting our money where our mouths are. I think in the college university space, that means putting our money where our mouths are, right? The university here established a scholarship program that paves the way for students from the reservations, referring to members of the Seminole Tribe of Florida, to attend Florida State. Many of these are the first in their families to attend college. And now, finally, this is a very proud statement, I imagine, that they were to write. Through the years, the administration has made it clear that the university will not engage in any activity that does not have the approval of the Seminole Tribe of Florida. So there are a couple things to point out here. I believe that FSU's approach is notable in that it is celebratory. And by that, I mean, they're not motivated by a sense of white guilt or settler colonial guilt, as we just talked about, but by a desire to really commemorate the history of indigenous people, and specifically indigenous resistance against colonialism. Not only to do that, but to uplift the present day Native communities in their region. They're future-minded, and they've made a measurable financial commitment to securing a better future for indigenous peoples that they are in community with. I believe that that provides us with a wonderful model moving forward. There's much to be said about the use of the Seminole name in and of itself, rather than calling themselves merely the Indians, or using some sort of other derivative word to refer to Native Americans as a vague, murky group of people. They have decided to wear the name and therefore the history and the struggle of a specific indigenous peoples that historically occupied the land where the university now sits upon. Now, this is a recent tweet from Nick Estes, who is professor of American Studies at the University of New Mexico and one of the founders of the Red Nation, a radical Native political organization. He tweeted this last week. He wrote, "The myth of free college for Native people always bothered me. Do you think the children of elites earned their money to pay for their schooling? Their tuition and fees come dripping head to toe in blood and soil. Make education a human right, not a privilege." Now, we believe that this tweet serves to orient us toward an understanding that colleges and universities have a unique role to play in resolving social disparities, such as that which exists between Native peoples and settlers in this country today. Now, as we close out, I'd like to leave you all with a question to ponder, and that is, what can Rockford University do? What role can we play as an institution of higher learning to better the conditions of Indigenous peoples in the United States? That concludes all of our slides.
Thank you both so much for this fascinating and very, very important conversation. And that last question may prompt responses from our attendees as well as questions. We have not too much time, maybe about 10 minutes or so for questions.
Hi, can you please show the previous slide, just the slide?
Now, which slide is that?
The tweet.
Oh, yeah, of course.
Thank you so much. Thank you.
May I ask a question, please?
Yes.
Could you go back to the slide of the pipeline map?
This map, the map.
Yes,
Yes,
yes.
of course.
I
Please.
mean, just viewing it on the screen, it would appear that the pipeline intersects a very small tip of the Indian reservation. I was wondering why the pipeline company didn't make what would appear to be a very simple accommodation of diverting that route by just a few miles and avoid the trespass.
That's a very good question. I'm not familiar enough with the process of the pipeline construction that led to that decision. I will wager that it had something to do with the sheer amount of moving parts and the sheer amount of stakeholders in the Dakota Access Pipeline. What a lot of activists, particularly in educational institutions, have learned from trying to build campaigns to get their institutions and their cities to divest from companies that hold stakes in pipeline construction is that it quickly becomes an impossible challenge because of the sheer diversity and number of companies that are invested in one way or another in the construction of oil pipelines in this country.
Other questions or thoughts from you all about land acknowledgements?
Do we know if there are, if or where there are any remnants of the tribes on whose land the campus stands?
I wrote to Joanna to ask her if there's any sort of history that she knows of, indigenous history, and she did not know of any.
No, I mean, are peoples from any of those tribes still living in the area or in nearby reservations? I mean, I have to confess, I don't know where the closest Indian reservation is. I'm presuming it's in Wisconsin somewhere.
Yes.
But I don't
Yes.
know, because
Yeah.
I wonder about, reaching out in terms of, what could we do? Do we even have any contacts with anybody from any of those tribes? I wonder. I'm guessing not.
We don't have those contacts, and those the reservations would be in Wisconsin, not in Illinois.
And not in Iowa or farther west? I thought at one point that Blackhawk and those who had survived after bad acts, I thought they were in Iowa for a while. And then
They were,
possibly,
but as far as I know,
it's all Wisconsin now.
yes.
Yeah, that
yes.
doesn't surprise me.
But I will say too, this is part, I guess, of a journey for us too. I'm
Oh, absolutely.
more about the Native American presence in this region. And as I mentioned before, it is very much focused on advertising, on things that are connected to popular culture too, that are very much focused in white culture too.
Right.
Really is a journey for us too, to just to learn more about the ways that we can acknowledge Native American history in this area, and to do something too.
Well, I would think one way to start doing that could be to reach out to Native Americans that are still in the area, wherever they are. And I don't know where they are.
I have a few connections through Zoe Norwood at the public library. She's made some connections for me in the past. And I want to make some reconnections there too. And Kristen writes, not sure if this timeline helps in regard to the pipeline. And Jules, I don't know if that's helpful to you to click on that note.
I'll look it up.
Yes, sorry to add. I didn't want to be like a quiet participatory, but I just wanted to share. Yeah, that NPR article kind of covers the timeline of the pipeline, and I think it wasn't so much like, oh, you're on the land, but as much about the possibility of the pipeline having an effect on polluting the water at large.
And I will say of course, the further east and north you get from the Mississippi, the harder it becomes to track the movement of the native peoples who originally occupied that land because of the centuries of displacement. But if we were looking at the tribes that historically occupied this region, you'll see on the list that the Oceti-Sakowin occupied northern Illinois. Historically, those are the people who are colloquially known as the Sioux, and who are thus split into two different language groups, the Lakota and Dakota, who form a significant population of the Standing Rock Indian Reservation in northern South Dakota.
Okay, yeah.
So I wouldn't sure who among them can trace their ancestry back to, say, northern Illinois, eastern Iowa, southern Wisconsin, but the movement of the peoples as categories as broad swaths has been tracked over time. And we see
Yeah,
where we
'cause-
are today.
That was a question I had about that list. Are these all nomadic tribes that kind of
No.
wandered or drifted through this
No.
area, or
I mean,
that's a
Blackhawks,
sequential, a time sequential list of different tribes that successively displaced each other?
no, I would say not. It's most of the tribes in this area, like Blackhawks tribe, and a number of them were moderately migratory in that they lived in different areas and moved around. They had fields, agricultural fields in one area, but then they might have some hunting grounds in another area. And so they moved around during the seasons, and then they wintered elsewhere often. And so many tribes would have conceivably passed through the area we live in now at various times. But even in Blackhawks times, there were a number of tribes that kind of worked around each other and shared the land.
And this region was a very diverse and heavily populated, even
Yeah,
between the different native tribes. This is Native Land, which is the Canadian website, which we used to get a bird's eye view of the native peoples that historically occupied this land.
Yeah.
If you zoom out, you can see that Lake Michigan is a nexus, particularly. It was a huge diversity of historical peoples who lived here.
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
this resource is one that you might take a look at, because we did find it referred to again and again. And what was the name of the website again, Ty?
That's nativeland.ca, native-land.ca.
Ty, could you copy and paste that into the chat so folks can click on it?
Yeah, because I know that the Sioux were pushed farther west and farther west from at least where we are, but I think even farther east as whites started to settle as Europeans settled on the East Coast, and word about all the, these problems. They're just like, yeah, we're moving.
And please do take a look at our webpage too. The information about land acknowledgements too on the Jane Addams Center page is part of our a group of pages that we've developed, social justice pages we've developed.
At Beatty Park in Rockford, there are 3 mounds. There's apparently are from the 5th to the 12th centuries.
Mm-hmm.
And back, I don't know, maybe Katie can remember, 70s and 80s when we had the Beatty art festival down there. It was a festival for children. Then we found that those mounds were there, and we no longer could have that festival at that place because of the mounds.
Yes, thank you for that. And then Jake, you put on, oh, it's a list.
Yeah, I did a little poking around. One way that is not without its problems to recognize Native peoples now is the 574 tribes that are recognized by the federal government and get some benefits from that. I just took a quick look at that, and there's none in Illinois. There are some in Wisconsin. I'll say I had a good friend in grad school who was an Arikara Indian, and we had some real conversations. And one of the things he pointed out repeatedly was, don't just talk about us in the past tense, that world's through here. And I like how that's been part of this conversation. And Ty, I really liked how you challenged us at the end to think about moving forward as an institution. What can we do to acknowledge the Native peoples that are still here?
Thank you, Jake.
On that note, this is Jen. Mary, have you brought up the possibility to our folks in charge of the webpage and or administration having a land acknowledgement? Has this been brought to the administration yet?
Ty and I talked with Mike a few weeks ago.
Okay.
And so we need to touch base with him again because we did propose that the university post a land acknowledgement.
I would think that Jane Addams Peace Garden Circle would be a lovely place to put something like that. Maybe.
Well, we could do both, yes.
If I may, one suggestion about what to do, certainly at the institutional level, but at the course level, we might think about ways that our courses can, that we can do research that therefore can be incorporated into courses. And I'll give an example that might at first seem counterintuitive. In the past, I've taught our etymology class, which is really based on Latin and Greek roots, 80 at least combined roots in English language. But I also include, it's really just a Google search of place names, Native American place names in the United States, starting in Illinois and spreading out to the states themselves, as well as counties and roads. And it's startling. It's startling when you just look at the 50 states and realize that there aren't all that many that are New York and New Jersey. There are a whole lot more names that did not come from the old world, as it were.
I teach a poem in the 19th century survey class that points to the way that we use place names based on Native American words without really recognizing, at least for that point in time, this is a poem from the 1830s, recognizing what was happening to Native Americans being pushed off their lands. So yeah, I was going to bring up place names earlier too. Oftentimes we see that as similar to that passage I read earlier too, as a way of recognizing, but also it became a way too of recognizing the vanishing Indian image. That phrase was one that was used in the 19th century. The Native American was a person of the past. It's a way of, I guess, maybe trying to say, oh, we're recognizing Native Americans when we aren't recognizing the realities of their lives.
There is an excellent work of art by a Native artist named James Luna called The Artifact Piece that is exactly about that topic, about Native American culture is a living culture and not one of the past to be relegated to natural history museums and displays of artifacts. And he's an excellent installation artist, so you might want to look that up.
What's his name again?
James Luna. And it's titled The Artifact Piece.
Thank you.
Yeah. If you have any trouble, just let me know. I can send you stuff on it.
Okay.
And on that note, everyone, we have gotten to the end of our hour. I know that some of you may have additional questions. Please contact Ty or Mary with those. And thank you again for joining us today and for participating in this important conversation.
Thanks you all.
Thank you.
Thank you for having us.